All right, looks like the participants number is no longer going up, so we'll go ahead and get started. I am Tara Haelle, and welcome to today's webinar, ACIP Countdown to Nothing Now, talking about the COVID vaccine and what else was going to be at stake at the ACIP and still is in a way, since we don't really know what the next steps from the administration are going to be. I'm the health beat leader on on infectious disease for the Association of Healthcare Journalists, and AHCJ is excited to partner once again with the Expert Vaccine Analysis Team, a team of internationally recognized and trusted vaccine experts whose scientists and physicians have a long track record of leadership in vaccines, infectious disease, and public health. The Association of Healthcare Journalists is the largest organization of health journalists in the US. And this briefing will be about the ACIP meeting that was going to occur and what they were going to discuss. But we're also going to talk about the lawsuit that put that meeting on hold. A reminder that AHCJ does not accept any kind of funding from pharmaceutical companies or other industry. Today, we have a full slate of folks. Richard Hughes, the lead attorney for the lawsuit with the AAP against Health and Human Services Secretary Robert Kennedy Jr. He's a health attorney at Epstein, Becker Green, and a professorial lecturer in law at the George Washington University Law School. We have Fiona Havers, MD, an adjunct associate professor at Emory University School of Medicine. Miles Braun, MD, an adjunct professor at Georgetown University School of Medicine. Norman Baylor, PhD, president and CEO of Biologics Consulting Group. And Paul Offit, MD, an attending infectious disease pediatrician and director of the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia Vaccine Education Center. A reminder that all attendees are muted during this webinar, and while speakers are presenting, you are welcome to ask questions at any time by typing them into the Q&A space. That's the question mark at the bottom of the Zoom frame. I'll direct questions to our guests. And also a reminder that a recording of this webinar will be publicly available later today or tomorrow. Anything said during this webinar is considered on the record for those of you who are journalists joining us. All right, and Richard is going to go ahead and start us off with a discussion of what the lawsuit was about between the AAP against Kennedy and what the ruling was that just came down yesterday and what happens next. Go ahead, Richard.
Thank you so much, Tara, and thank you for having me today. Obviously, I'm thrilled to be here to talk about our success yesterday. Great victory for vaccines, for public health, for science policy, for evidence-based decision making in government. And so I never thought I would be in the position of asking a federal judge to stop the ACIP from meeting or being responsible for stopping the ACIP from meeting. So it's a really bizarre world we're living in. I went to law school to fight for vaccine access, not to go to court. I'm not that kind of a lawyer. But we knew when this secretary came into office, when President Trump selected him and nominated him, that we were going to be in for a ride. We knew that the secretary was going to do things to undermine the vaccine schedule all across the HHS agencies to undermine vaccines. And so we started to prepare for that. A very large team that began as early as November of 2024, really looking for statements and actions. And we knew that ultimately we would see a final agency action that would be carried out in an arbitrary and capricious manner. That's the standard under the Administrative Procedure Act. And so while the secretary has a lot of authority, a lot of policymaking authority, how he wields it really matters. And the Administrative Procedure Act really provides a check on that. It requires that agencies that folks in the executive branch don't act in a manner that's arbitrary and capricious, that they engage in reasoned decision making, that they look at evidence, they follow processes, and they provide rationale for their decisions. And we knew that that would not be the case. And of course, this started. Apologies, I've got some weather change congestion here. So we knew that we were just looking for the moment that the secretary announced some sort of change in vaccine policy, which we saw back last May with the 58-second directive. And then, of course, we saw the subsequent actions to reconstitute the ACIP. We saw the ACIP start to make its own changes. And then we saw the January 5th schedule changes. And so we filed a complaint last July in the District of Massachusetts in federal court. and we amended that complaint 4 times, and we survived in January. So the day after the new schedule was released, so on January 6th, we won. We won against the government's motion to dismiss the case, and so the judge found that we had standing in this case, and then we proceeded with our request for preliminary injunction. And so, what we asked the judge for was to enjoin the May directive from last year on COVID, to enjoin the appointment of the ACIP members, to enjoin implementation of the January 5th schedule, and to block the ACIP from meeting further. And so we were in court twice to argue for that preliminary injunction, once on February 13th and the other on March 4th. And, by the time we left the courtroom on March 4th, it became clear that the judge was likely to issue one order on all of these things. And so we were, of course, anxiously awaiting his order, which landed yesterday. It's 45 pages. It's beautifully written. I will say that, judges are not policymakers. This judge was very serious about getting the law right. He only wanted to apply the law. It was clear to us. He asked a lot of tough questions. He wanted to get this right. And so it really opens very beautifully with a quote from Carl Sagan. Science, like law, is far from a perfect instrument of knowledge. History is littered with once universal truths that have since come under scrutiny. Nevertheless, science is still the best we have. He talks about the importance of procedure. Procedure is to law what scientific method is to science. I just think that's a wonderful, beautiful analogy that just has felt so true to me throughout this case. He talks about the apparatus that has been built up over decades in public health, and of which ACIP is a part. And so it's a great opinion for folks who want to give it a read. He goes through each and every one of our claims and sets out the facts in the law, but ultimately concludes that he grants our request for preliminary relief in part. And it says in part, but we essentially got everything that we wanted here. So the court stayed the January 26th, the January 5th memo replacing the immunization schedule. He stayed the appointments of 13 members of the ACIP, and he stayed all votes taken by the now stayed ACIP. And then one of the immediate questions for those of you who, like me, were scrambling to read the opinion while you were getting a million phone calls yesterday. At first, it looked like because he did not stay the ACIP from meeting, that they would be able to go ahead and meet. But if you look at page 44 of his opinion, this is a really nice line here. It says that while the appointments of the challenged members of ACIP are stayed, ACIP as currently constituted cannot meet. For how can a committee meet without nearly the entirety of its membership? And so, if a group of 13 folks want to get together in Atlanta, Georgia, and talk about vaccines, I know a great sandwich place across from the CDC, it will not constitute an ACIP meeting if they decide to do that. So there you have it. And, I've been asked a lot about what happens next. I'll just be really brief, Tara, with that. This is a stay. It's not vacature. It's not an injunction. And that means that it really should not be appealable. So the government has announced that it intends to appeal. We will likely see a notice of appeal. If that's rejected by the First Circuit, they're likely to try to take it up to the Supreme Court on the emergency docket. So we'll see how that plays out. But this is the type of ruling that, while it's great and it has a legal effect, it's not final, and it should not be appealable. That's our position on this. And so what we expect to do is to go forward to ask the judge to move forward with a trial on the merits. We might see cross motions for summary judgment. We'll see how we're going to proceed over the next months. There's a lot of details to be worked out. And I'm happy to answer more questions when we get to the Q&A. Gary, you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I said thank you, Richard. That was very nicely and succinctly summed up. Now we're going to move on to Dr. Havers, who will discuss the evidence framework for assessing the risk-benefit of vaccines and making recommendations. This is the evidence framework that has been used for many years with ACIP that was originally going to be on the table for discussing changing it. Go ahead, Fiona.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. So I was at CDC for 13 years and most recently did a lot of work on COVID and RSV vaccine policy until I resigned in June of 2025. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about what ACIP meetings should look like and what they look like in the before times, because I think many of you have been watching the recent ACIP meetings, which are not typical of what was usually done. I'm going to just talk very briefly about kind of what steps CDC and ACIP would take to form a policy question and to actually make a final policy recommendation change that would change the CDC immunization schedule. So there, I put the steps on this slide here. The policy question would initially be identified, and that would be if, for example, a new vaccine was coming down the pipeline and was likely to get approved at some point. A work group would be formed for ACIP. And these members would go through conflicts of interest vetting. They would be very carefully selected with a wide range of expertise. Then over many, many months, the work group would refine the question, look at the target population, systematically review all of the data related to this vaccine. And this, generally speaking, all of this entire process would maybe take 1 to 2 years. And so they would systematically review the data. There would also be input from liaison organizations, and that would be the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Infectious Disease Society of America, all the professional medical societies, also groups like the American Pharmacists Association or the Association for Immunization Managers, which would be like state and local health departments, would give input on things like implementation and feasibility. And they would be joining the work group and be able to talk in that setting. There would also be a formal process where the evidence would be evaluated through the grade process, and then there would also go through the evidence to recommendation framework. And I'm going to talk about both of those in a little bit more detail in a minute. But the evidence would be compiled by the CDC work group lead, who's usually a CDC career scientist, but reviewed by the work group, and they would vote, make recommendations. Those would then be formally presented to the ACIP voting members at the meetings that would occur publicly. There would be a discussion, a public comment, and a vote. And then if the CDC director concurred with the recommendations, a policy note would be published, usually in the MMWR, and then the immunization schedule officially changed. And as you all know, ACIP is very important because it's tied to the Affordable Care Act. A lot of states base their school immunization requirements on ACIP recommendations. So once the official policy is made, it has very large implications. But it was a very systematic, long process. And so to see the number of policy changes that we've seen since June, without going through most of this process, has been pretty disturbing. So hopefully we can get back to that. A couple of words about GRADE and ETR. So GRADE stands for the Grading of Recommendations, Assessment, Development, and Evaluation. And it is a system that's designed to evaluate and rate the quality and the certainty of the evidence and also to inform the strength of the recommendations. It was developed more than 25 years ago. And just everyone should know this is not just a CDC ACIP thing. It's used widely by a number of medical societies, the World Health Organization, groups like the American Thoracic Society, or if you look at guidelines for like joint infections or something, they will use GRADE. But it was adopted formally by ACIP in 2010. So all of the studies, the randomized controlled trials would get the highest rating of evidence, and then observational studies would get lower ratings of evidence. But they would be compiled in these formal tables following a systematic format by the CDC work group lead. They'd be reviewed by the work group. They would go through, the presentation would go through a scientific clearance process. They'd be presented at public meetings, and then they'd be posted on the website. And if you go to the link that I included on the slide here, you can see the grade tables for every vaccine policy decision since they adopted GRADE or all of the recent ones that have been published in the MMWRs. And there are dozens of them, but there are none from 2025 that are posted on that link because this administration basically stopped doing GRADE and ETR. So that's GRADE. The next one was Evidence to Recommendations Framework. And this is basically a systematic framework that translates evidence into recommendations that considers additional factors that are not in GRADE. And this was started in 2018. This was adopted formally by ACIP in 2018. And so these domains, which again the work group would go through and systematically vote on, and their recommendations would be voting on like the public health importance, the benefits and harms, and this is where a lot of the evidence from the GRADE tables or like, the efficacy and the effectiveness of the vaccine versus any, potential safety concerns or other things would be weighed. But evidence recommendation also systematically looks at the values of the target population, the feasibility and acceptability of the potential policy change. And this is where things like shared clinical decision making versus a routine recommendation, when the type of recommendation that would, and the sort of potential, like any barriers to implementation if a certain type of recommendation was made, would be discussed systematically. Resource use, this would be cost effectiveness. Often CDC would commission its own cost effectiveness studies, something that would take many, many months to put together, but it would look at the impact and resource use for a specific vaccine policy recommendation. And then also if a disease or a vaccine was thought to impact specific populations differentially, the impact on health equity would be looked at. So the work group would systematically go through and vote on each of these domains, as well as the overall balance of consequences. And then their votes would be summarized by the CDC work group lead and formally presented at the ACIP public meetings. And then once the ACIP voting members had seen the work group's recommendations, they would then vote. But the evidence to recommendations with the framework would be posted on the CDC website. So generally speaking, this process was very rigorous. It was very systematic and evidence-based, and also very transparent. And by doing away or ignoring grade and ETR in the recent discussions, it's allowed people on ACIP to cherry pick data, to bring up studies kind of randomly. A lot of these domains never really got discussed in any systematic way at the meetings. So hopefully we will be able to get back to that. But I also wanted to flag that at this meeting, they had planned to discuss this methodology and potentially vote to change it. And if these meetings go forward, they may still do that. But it is a good system. It worked well. There was a lot of confidence in the vaccine policy processes. So that's kind of a quick overview of how ACIP used to work, and hopefully a system we'll get back to. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Havers. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Braun. He's going to give us a brief overview of the vaccine safety and monitoring systems and the findings to date on COVID vaccine safety, since it had appeared that ACIP was going to be discussing COVID vaccine safety and injuries.
Thanks. Can we go to the display presentation, if possible? I'm going to start here, jumping right in with myocarditis, which has been the major adverse event that's been flagged after COVID vaccination. And this graph here shows, you can see in the largest bar that 38 persons per million vaccinees in the 12 to 39-year age group could be expected or were observed to have myocarditis after COVID mRNA vaccination. And there's a line at the bottom of the bar, near the bottom, that shows the number that would be expected, and it would be around 1 or 2 that would be expected by chance in the 7 days after vaccination. So to say that if you have 38 people who have myocarditis after COVID vaccination, 1 or 2 of them would have had it in the event anyway without the vaccine. So that's the background rate we say. Now, if you go to the right side of the graph, you'll see that in the later years, the incidence of myocarditis has dropped. That's probably due to depletion of susceptibles. People who were susceptible to this either had already gotten it due to the vaccine or the disease of COVID. So if you look at that right graph, the events that would occur or did occur, they were about what would you expect in the absence of vaccination. So this is just a caution to be careful that just because someone had an event, even a proven adverse reaction to vaccine, if they have it after, doesn't necessarily mean in that person that it was caused by the vaccination. Next slide, please. So this feeds into what I would call perennial. Do we have the next slide up? Perennial fallacy.
Yes, your slides are up, Miles.
Okay. I'm just seeing a different screen here. Okay, so let me see. So in the perennial fallacy, it's been known since Aristotle that just because something happens after something else, it doesn't mean it caused it. And we all know this, but sometimes our hearts go out to people and there are stories of suffering after a vaccination. And we need to keep in mind, the science side of things, not to jump to conclusions. Next slide. So CDC has a great vaccine safety data link, but there are also systems in the Department of Defense, the VA, Nordic countries like Denmark and Sweden, and they've really contributed a lot to what we know. So we're not just at a US-centered system, and it's hard for any one entity. It's impossible really to control the data from all of these systems, as you might hear. Now, the vaccine, the next slide, the vaccine or drug safety investigator's mission, which I was a regulator and an investigator. And in my career, I'm most pleased, for example, about having identified syncope after vaccination or fainting, which when you get a vaccine in the United States, that's highlighted to everybody on the sheet of paper we get. And I first reported that. And investigators, they in a way want to describe the truth about vaccine safety. And if there are adverse events, we want to identify them. And I think for those who are journalists on the call, it's like getting a scoop to discover a new adverse event. And it's important to remember that the investigators are motivated to find problems if they exist. In the next slide, you can never prove a negative, okay? And we hear people say, well, no one's proven that vaccines don't cause autism, but the reality, it's just a scientific philosophical reality is you can't examine every possible situation that could occur after vaccination, whether it's the age groups or the concomitant medications, concomitant diseases, et cetera. So you can never prove a negative, and we just have to be comfortable with that. But there may be no evidence to support a problem, but that's different. And so people may argue you can never prove that you can't disprove adverse event X is caused by the vaccine. So with the current secretary, who we heard about already, he's saying that he promotes gold standard science, highest standards of safety and efficacy testing. So the leaked report, I think we're on the next slide now, post-COVID vaccination chronic injuries proposed action report, it really was not what I would call gold standard science. And I think the dissenter from the group, several of them noted some really good points that there's no definition that's drafted. So how could you actually get a good ICD code from it? And really, it's not going to help describe the science of what's going on with this problem. Okay, so I think that the other part, if you looked at the definition, you can see that it was just so broad in what they wanted to include, such as micronutrient deficiencies, which many people have apart from vaccination, and microbiome dysbiosis, things like that, that are could be related to so many other factors. To put them in there and say that you could just have one of these, and there's a whole laundry list of them, to establish a biologic disease is, again, it's not gold standard science. So I'm going to end. I know we're to make time for others. I want to recommend, I'm Miles Braun, but I want to recommend Paul Offit's Substack, which is really courageous and insightful and interesting beyond the noise. So you can keep up with issues as they arise there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miles. Excuse me. Now we're going to hear from Dr. Baylor on product quality evaluation and monitoring both pre and post licensure.
Good afternoon, everyone, or some of you may still be on morning. I wanted to really emphasize here the importance of the manufacturing of vaccines and how vaccines are manufactured and tested. Uh, it's really the first line when you're looking at manufacturing. The product safety is really assessed at that point, and by the manufacturers as well as the regulatory authorities. And starts out as, from a preclinical, looking at animal studies, uh, moving into phase one, two, and three, as all of you know, and then moving into large clinical trials. All of this is part of looking at and testing the vaccine and how that vaccine's manufactured. And I think one of the most important things is when you look at what the manufacturers have to do, all of the assays, all of the tests, everything needs to be validated and qualified. And when you hear, you read in a paper or something like that, this particular test was done, this was the results of a particular test. Most of these are laboratory researchers, and the processes that they're using are not validated and are not required to be validated. And that's the important part of looking at vaccines that are going to be licensed in the United States. These are established and accepted assays from other regulatory authorities, evaluated and accepted by other regulatory authorities, as well as by organizations like the International Conference on Harmonization. So vaccines are rigorously tested, and uh, when you hear things about genotoxicity or contaminants, these are things that the FDA and other regulatory authorities have looked at, have evaluated. And with COVID vaccines, I mean, we're well past a billion doses, and things are monitored, facilities are inspected. Um, and it's looking at and evaluating these products throughout their entire life cycle. So as long as these products are licensed or approved, these type of things are looked at, evaluated, and even, post-licensure, looking at real world evidence and really not ignoring the products once they're licensed. It's again entire evaluation and assessment throughout the life cycle of the product. So I think it's very important for journalists in particular to understand when you're reading a manuscript what went into that manuscript and the evaluation of that manuscript, not maybe by peer review, but not necessarily by a regulatory authority, not necessarily using validated assays. And I think this is a critical component of vaccine safety, building the safety into the product based on the manufacturing, based on the chemistry, manufacturing, and control aspects of the product. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you very much, Norman. Now we are going to wrap up with Paul Offit, who will give us kind of an overview or sort of wrap it all up for us, and we'll move on to questions. And also, thank you to all of our speakers. You guys are doing a fabulous job of moving things through since we have such a full slate today. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Paul.
Okay, so I'm just going to speak for a couple minutes, but there was a documentary in 2010 called "Waiting for Superman," and it was really an indictment of the public health system. But it was true, and it focused on a young boy who became a teacher. But he talked about how, as a young man, he desperately wanted to learn. There was so much he wanted to learn, and he couldn't because the public health system was constructed in a way that he just couldn't learn it. And the way that he handled that as a little boy was to imagine that Superman would come to save him, and how devastated he was when he learned that Superman was actually a fictional character. And I feel like that's what's been happening here. When Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Became Secretary of Health and Human Services, we moved anti-vaccine activism into policymaking, and it was very successful in the sense that we were convincing people that vaccines might be unnecessary or should be optional or dangerous, and it had its effect in that. We had 2 measles deaths last year in little girls, healthy little girls, when we hadn't seen a measles measles death in children since 2003. We had more deaths from influenza last year in children, about 289, and another 90 deaths this year so far. We haven't seen numbers that big since the last flu pandemic. We had 13 children die of whooping cough last year in states that hadn't seen whooping cough deaths in years. And similarly, there were just a couple cases that I learned about of Haemophilus influenza B serious infections in one state over a 6-month period, much greater than you would have ever expected. And I wonder whether that is also worse than we know. I wonder whether all of this is potentially worse than we know because the CDC has shredded surveillance and monitoring. And so I too was sort of waiting for Superman, and Superman came. Here, Superman wasn't a fictional character. I think in the person of Richard Hughes and his law firm, and then groups like the American Academy of Pediatrics and IDSA and others stood up for children. And I think what happened yesterday was a great day for children. I don't know how long this is going to last, but I think it was at least a moment where Superman wasn't fictional. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul. Okay, this is the first time I have ever reached this point in the webinar and not had any questions in the Q&A. So please, this is a great opportunity to ask questions. Looks like some people have already had some questions, and I'm going to mention those in case people haven't seen them. When Richard used the term stayed, that means that it's essentially legally blocked. So staying the meeting means that the meeting cannot occur because, well, in this case, they didn't say the meeting, but the evidence recommendations that they made, the vaccine recommendations that they made are stayed, which means that they don't take effect. And the appointments of the individual members to the new formulation of ACIP was essentially blocked. I do have a follow-up question for that, which is, does that mean that the CDC, I don't remember if they actually changed their website or not, but does this mean that the changes they made to the hepatitis B vaccine, the COVID vaccine way back in May, and then the 4 vaccines that were changed in early January, are they, in theory, is the CDC going to have to change their website so that they are what they were prior to January 2025, Richard?
Yes.
Like,
Yeah.
okay.
To be compliant with the court's order, that they have to do that. That's right. If they don't do that, they're not in compliance with the court's order.
And the ever-present question that I have wondered since literally day one of this administration, what if they don't? What's the enforcement mechanism?
Oh, it's a great question. It's a great question, Tara. And in fact, it should be up right now on MedPage today. I just wrote an article about it and
Okay.
the rule of law and compliance. And we mentioned it's not about our lawsuit. It's literally about the question that you asked. But we do mention our lawsuit in it. And so my hope is they comply. I mean, we are at a very precarious, we're in a very precarious time when it comes to the role of the courts. And, let's hope they comply.
And then Liz had asked you this question. You answered it in the Q&A, but I want to bring it back about whether or not the Supreme Court might take up this case. And you said the term ends around late June, so the timing revolves around that. But can you give us a sense of, is there a likelihood that this would get appealed? Do we think it won't get appealed? What would that look like? And how, I know you just said the term ends around late June, but it seems like I don't have a sense of what that means in terms of the likelihood of us hearing about that soon. If you could contextualize that for us. Richard, are you there?
I'm so sorry. Can you answer that again, Nicole? Sorry, Tara. I'm having an issue.
No problem. No problem.
Sorry.
Liz had asked how soon we could expect the Supreme Court to take up the case, and you responded to that in there saying the term ends around late June and the timing depends around that. Can you give us how likely is this that it would or wouldn't go to the Supreme Court? And
Yeah.
I don't know what it means that the timing is around late June. Can you contextualize what you like what that means basically?
Yeah, absolutely. So really, I think the only way that you are likely to see this, you're going to see this potentially go to the Supreme Court at 2 points. And both of those points could occur before the end of June, or one could occur before the end of June and the other next October or and beyond. And so I know we love the uncertainty here, and I apologize that it's so uncertain. But what would happen potentially is that, as I said, the government tries to appeal to the First Circuit and they get rejected, and so they try to take it straight to the Supreme Court on the emergency docket. Then the Supreme Court would essentially have until the end of its term, end of June, beginning of July, to say something about that. And they could just reject it, or they could actually take it up. They could rule on the emergency docket. Okay, so there's that. There is some potential. Okay, so then okay, barring all of that, we still have to litigate this case. And so, as we're going through the litigation, if by chance we actually were able to get through motions for summary judgment or a trial and get a decision in time for them to appeal it to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court to rule, you see where this starts to stack up to be really unlikely by the end of June. It's more likely that all of that's going to play out, hopefully fast, then it would be appealed on the merits to the Supreme Court in the next term. And so, what you're very likely to see is over the next few months, a little bit of uncertainty over the stay, a lot of back and forth over whether it's going to go up in the courts. And then hopefully we win, by the fall. And then next term, you're going to probably hear about the case AAP versus Kennedy pending before the Supreme Court is kind
Okay.
of the
And
potential.
and just to clarify, so this was not like this ruling was not the end game. You have a larger case, and this was like one step in that process to say, hey, while we figure all this out, we need
Yes.
to put a hold on that, right? Just to make sure
Yes.
I understand. Okay. So
That
then,
is the nature of a stay. That's
okay.
exactly
I just
right.
want to make
Yep.
sure that people listening also understood that this is like this is
Yeah,
the hey, let's call time out while we're trying to figure all this stuff out because you
that's
guys are
right.
moving too fast trying to change things. Okay.
That's exactly right.
And I don't think that any changes occurred to insurance or CMS coverage as a result of. Does anyone? I don't. This might be a question for Norman or for Paul. Were there any changes that did occur in insurance coverage because of the ACIP changes, or was everything being covered? In other words, do we have to worry about whether insurance is now going to cover something they wouldn't have, or vice versa?
Paul, do you want to weigh in on that? I would like to as well, but do you want to weigh in on
No,
that?
yeah, my understanding was no, the insurance coverage hadn't changed, but I yield to you, Richard.
Sure. And so, the, it all got complicated right after they started making some of these changes, right? And it used to be that when we had clear recommendations and they were routine recommendations that payers covered them, there were always questions about shared clinical decision making. And so once this upheaval started, what we saw was AHIP and others came out and said, we will cover. It still concerns me that there are payers out there, namely United Health Group, that have consistently been bad actors and have not covered shared clinical decision-making recommendations. So while we can blanketly say most payers were going to do the right thing or saying they were going to do the right thing, there's always bad actors, there's always outliers, and that concerns me.
But one quick thing, Richard, wasn't
Yeah,
it true that
yeah,
even before RFK Jr. took over, there was shared clinical decision making for meningococcal B vaccine,
that's right.
and that didn't change the coverage.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. We would see like United and some other payers just refuse to cover those recommendations. Um, yeah, that's right.
Here's a good question. Does this decision stay any new appointments to ACIP?
It does not. But if we see additional appointments to ACIP, you can rest assured that we will act.
You'll file a motion to basically stay that one, and we could go in
Yeah.
circles forever with this.
Yes.
Um, and so
Yeah.
the next legal step right now is waiting to hear, I guess, what HHS replies with, or what's the next legal step?
Yeah. So we have to see what they do in terms of notice of appeal. And so we'll be watching for that. So there's the matter of the administrative record. The administrative record is basically what did they look at? What are all the papers that are relevant to their decisions? And what we have right now are the relevant papers that what they say is relevant, what they say is the relevant administrative record to the May directive on COVID from last year. I will tell you it is unimpressive. We don't see emails between the secretary and other people. We don't see text messages. We know those things exist and we want those things. On Monday, we are going to get the rest, we are supposed to get the rest of the administrative record from the administration on these other changes. I want to see the text messages and the emails between Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Aaron Siri because we know that Aaron Siri was involved in the vetting of the members. And so what we're likely to see is this back and forth over what they produce. We're going to we're probably going to file a motion to complete the record if the record's incomplete. And if they want to, jerk us around on this, we're probably going to ask for extra record discovery. So that, may go as far as asking for some depositions.
And can you remind everybody who Aaron Siri is, why his involvement here?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a little bit of,
Yeah.
Kennedy and Siri might not be on
Yeah.
ACIP, but pulling the puppet
Yeah.
strings behind the scenes
Oh
kind of
yeah.
thing.
Yeah, Aaron Siri, for those who don't know, is a nefarious actor. He's an anti-vaccine activist lawyer. He's a compatriot of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and he has a long history of filing citizens petitions and the like, spreading misinformation, trying to influence vaccine policy from the outside, but now he has access on the inside. And so he was involved, we discovered, in the vetting of potential ACIP members, and we made the court aware of that.
And I'm pretty sure we covered this, but just to clarify one last time, because I know this is going to be the most confusing part for people. This means we automatically go back to last year's guidance. At the same time, the schedule the doctors should be following, most doctors were already following the AAP schedule, which corresponded to the one last year. Correct, Paul? Is that right? You're
Yeah, no, that's my understanding. Yes.
yeah, I mean, I think most doctors were already still following the AAP. When the CDC went off the rails, they trusted the doctors as opposed to the political appointees. Um, this is another question. The current ACIP approved clesrovimab last year, and for those who are unaware, that's another monoclonal antibody for RSV vaccine. If that ruling is stayed, what does that mean for insurance coverage and vaccines for children coverage of that product, since that's our second monoclonal antibody?
It raises some concerning questions, and um, I want to get through this and get a resolution of the case so that we can ensure that we have viable recommendations, viable VFC inclusion for those
Okay.
products.
Can I
Yeah.
just
Tina,
make
do you
one
have?
comment about
Yeah,
that? So
I was
that,
going to ask you to.
yeah, no, so that was actually, that's one of the only sort of new products that this sort of reconstituted ACIP had approved. What happened was that the ACIP work group for RSV vaccines had gone through the entire ETR and grade process prior to the ACIP committee getting fired in June. So they actually presented it to the brand new, like, sort of, all this nonsense committee that they appointed in June, and they voted to approve it. But they had the previous, like, legit ACIP work group had actually reviewed and gone over everything and recommended its approval. So that was sort of a legitimate vote, but by an illegitimate committee. And so, but it was a new product, and because they voted for it, it was covered by insurance. It's a great, it's an effective monoclonal antibody that went through the full FDA and CDC review before all of this process was disrupted. So that is a good question, and like I would defer to the legal experts in terms of what's going to happen with that. But that is something that probably should continue to be recommended, even though it actually predates, it actually sort of postdates all the disruption that we've had. So I think it's going to be maybe
Do
a
you
little bit
know
less.
if insurance is going to cover it just as they do the other monoclonal antibody?
They have been. I mean, because of the vote, they have been. Again, that's a question for, I guess, for Richard or others in terms of whether or not this legal decision, and because it was voted to be approved at the June meeting after, this by the new ACIP committee, whether or not how that plays out.
So there is a really other complicated layer in here that I wasn't gonna add on, but I think this makes it sort of important. Is that under the commercial insurance rules under the ACA, payers, very unfortunately, so if you take the date of an ACIP recommendation and you go forward to the 1 year anniversary of that recommendation, payers have until the beginning of the plan year following that 1 year anniversary. So this is absolutely ridiculous. Under the law, payers have almost up to 2 years for many new recommendations to provide coverage. So we were actually we were still in the window where they were not actually technically required to provide coverage under commercial health insurance or Medicaid expansion. Um, Actually, sorry, Medicaid expansion is irrelevant for this one. So under commercial health insurance coverage. So unfortunate, that's already unfortunate. Hopefully, payers are already doing the right thing, and hopefully, payers continue to do the right thing by covering this product. That's my hope. And the VFC issue is an unfortunate one, and I hope that it can get resolved as quickly as possible.
Got it. And Bruce Gellin made a comment that's also true. I mentioned the AAP, but in addition to the AAP, other medical societies like the American Academy of Family Physicians, American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the Infectious Disease Society of America, they are all also making recommendations to their members for the patients they care for. I think a lot of them have also endorsed the AAP's official schedule that's online. Is there any chance that the ACIP current fake folks, whatever, will meet anyway and try and say something, or?
Is that question for me?
Anybody who knows, I don't know. Any of you?
I mean, again, they can all. There's a great sandwich spot called the General Muir. If they want to meet there, and talk about vaccines, I mean, sure, it won't be a meeting of the ACIP.
Okay.
Yeah,
They don't say anything that's binding, basically.
no, no. And if they try to make it in any way official, no.
And a couple folks asking how this will affect the VFC program. My guess is it won't change anything right now. That's kind of what we were just discussing with the health insurance stuff, right?
That's different than the VFC program.
No, I
So,
know that, but I mean, I
yeah,
think in this case,
yeah.
don't the same, well, the same sort of the same concept applies, not the same rules and laws.
Right. There's the concern that it's not that the resolution, right, that was passed by these members falls away, and therefore it may not be in the program. Now, in reality, there's a contract in place. Doses have been ordered and purchased and distributed, and arguably, that could keep things afloat. But I don't know if Paul or Fiona, if anybody has another thought there.
Does anyone want to jump in on that one? Okay. This is a very technical legal question. I'm just going to read it exactly because I don't actually know what this means. If the Supreme Court denies the government an emergency hearing in the current term, would the government be permitted to apply for cert on the regular docket in the next term in
Yes.
2027?
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry, I'm not very legally.
Yeah. No, no, that's a great question. That's exactly what I was getting at earlier when I said they'll have sort of two bites at the apple. That's exactly right.
Well, what does
Well,
that
well
mean?
said. Yeah,
Not
yeah,
implying.
yeah, yeah. So essentially, what the government would be appealing to the Supreme Court on the basis of the current stay, which we don't expect. I do not expect the First Circuit is going to take that appeal. So, okay, they would file a notice of appeal with the First Circuit. I expect the First Circuit would reject that. Then they could potentially try to get the Supreme Court to take it up. Hopefully, the Supreme Court rejects that. This is all on the stay. Okay. Now, remember, we have a stay pending the litigation. We still have to litigate this case. So we are going to go through motion practice. We're going to go through, hopefully, a trial. Hopefully, we're going to get a positive decision. It's that final decision that the government could file a petition for certiorari if they lose at the First Circuit to take it to the Supreme Court. And that is when the Supreme Court would consider, taking the full case on the merits. That's why I said next term, you're likely to see, you're potentially will see an AAP versus Kennedy case before the Supreme Court.
Okay. And this next question is probably for any of the doctors, Miles, Paul, Fiona. Um, Given all of this craziness happening, people are going to be more confused than ever, just the average person, and probably even a lot of clinicians who are just trying to do their everyday business and follow what they need to do in their offices, and they don't have time to read every single update that's happening. What kind of message should public health advocates and experts and journalists be pushing out in terms of helping people understand the big picture here and what it means for them, sort of on the ground in the trenches?
I can start and then yield to Fiona and others. But my understanding from talking to pediatricians anyway is that they really have been ignoring the ACIP and the CDC and looking at the AAP schedule, and I think Sue Kresley, when she was president of the AAP, when all this was happening, has done a good job at getting that information out there. I mean, they have their own expert advisory committee, the so-called Red Book Committee or Committee of Infectious Diseases, which normally works in liaison with the ACIP and CDC, but now they work independently and well. So I think certainly physicians are having more discussions about the importance of vaccines, but I think at some level that happens anyway, just because we don't see many of these vaccine preventable diseases, so people are less compelled by the diseases. That, in combination with the fact that you have so much misinformation out there that's so readily available that scares you, so you're in some ways more compelled by vaccine safety than you are by fear of the disease. So I think that was happening anyway. I think what happened when RFK Jr. became Secretary of HHS and we started to bring anti-vaccine activity into policymaking, it became even more confusing, but it never was going to go away. So I think I'm not sure this will make a big difference, but it certainly backs up the physician if somebody says, "Oh, I thought, that that the rotavirus vaccine or the flu vaccine or the COVID vaccines were now sort of optional, you can say that's not true. These are recommended vaccines.
Yeah, I mean, I think it will be helpful. Oh, is it okay if I talk?
I
Okay.
was gonna, I was gonna, you know, you just go.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do think that sort of until this all settles out and we get like a legit ACIP committee with like legit experts back, I do think that saying like following the AAP guidelines for
Yeah.
childhood recommendations and all of that, I think just consistently sticking with that is probably worthwhile. I will point out though that there are legitimate questions that ACIP kind of needs to answer. For example, there are adult RSV vaccines that became available for the first time 3 years ago. When those need to, when how long they last was an open question, and the revaccination interval affecting like older adults is a question that ACIP, it was like a challenging legit scientific question that we needed a good committee to so hopefully this will move forward. We can get a legitimate scientific committee back that will use the proper processes, evaluate and value scientific evidence, and we can get back to actually making like good evidence-based decisions coming from the federal government again. But I think for right now, I think telling clinicians just to like consistently say that they're following professional society guidelines
Can,
where
can I
relevant is
can
good.
I ask Fiona a question, Tara? Is that okay?
Go for it, please.
So if you take a company like, say, Merck that makes, this new RSV monoclonal, and now they have data, for example, on the second season for high risk groups. Normally, what would happen is they don't go to the ACIP to sort of inform them. They go to the CDC to inform them about, what those data are. If you talk to people on the in the on the who are part of this company, they'll say they don't know who to go to at the CDC anymore because a lot of the people who they would have gone to aren't there anymore. So it's not just the ACIP, it's the CDC that's gotten shredded in terms of that. But
Yeah.
what do you think about that?
I mean, I do think that ACIP, they like, for example, the adult RSV work group would have been a forum where CDC officials, along with the ACIP, like working group experts, would be reviewing those data systematically, and they would be seeing that. But I also think that there has been, a devastating exodus of expertise at CDC. There still are a lot of people there, and there are still people to answer questions and all that. But I mean, in the division where I used to work, which did COVID and RSV, like there's been a huge loss of senior experts and leadership. And so I do think it's probably is more challenging. I mean, the processes are still there, but I also think there's a whole bunch of political appointees now at CDC that are gatekeeping a lot of interactions with CDC experts with other people. And so I think that CDC as an agency is struggling to function. In many ways, it's still functional, and there's a lot of people doing really great work there, and they're keeping the lights on. But I do think that sort of all of this has disrupted the normal processes, including the interactions and the sort of information gathering that CDC, how CDC would interact with pharma as well as probably FDA as well. But it is really challenging.
A lot
And
these
Miles,
questions, if I could jump in here, I think raise the issue, kind of beg the question that headlines have shown that the White House has asked RFK Jr. to pivot away from vaccines. And this decision got a lot of publicity yesterday. And I don't think that's what they're wanting because it's not popular politically. So, do you think that this is actually going to restrict the amount of resistance to this decision? Or do you think that HHS is going to continue to fight the decision of yesterday?
Miles, it's a really excellent question, and do look at that MedPage Today op-ed that they just printed of mine. Or published. It's a great question because they strike this tone of defiance, right, in all their official messaging from the White House, from Andrew Nixon at HHS. They strike this defiant tone. Um, there was a New York Times analysis that said over 198 orders are being slow walked by the administration. I hope that the political recognition that what he's doing on vaccines are a loser, which we've seen the reporting, right, the last couple of weeks. There have been a couple of really great stories. I hope that recognition, I hope this defeat being handed to them, I hope all that sort of puts a chilling effect on anything that the secretary's doing. I hope it means that Children's Health Defense, can't quite get the bidding in that they need, that they've been able to with the secretary and with the people around the secretary. So I hope it really slows all of that down. And yeah, I mean, I hope the administration complies. But I mean, I think we're going to get we're going to get a lot of net benefit out of this ruling and the political backlash that they're starting to feel.
I'm going to add a comment from someone that the American College of Physicians has also been very active in addressing vaccines for adults, who often get forgotten in a lot of this.
That has
And
been true. Yeah. I'm an
yeah,
internist too. And I just want to give a shout out. Like a lot of, I mean, the majority of deaths from like flu and COVID, there are tens of thousands of people that die from flu and COVID every year in the United States. And those are mostly among older adults. And I do think that a lot of this vaccine like the false information about vaccines, about safety, does impact vaccination rates in like very vulnerable like senior populations or other adult populations. So we talk a lot about the childhood immunization schedule, but I really appreciate how outspoken the American College of Physicians has been. And also adult vaccines have a big impact and cost probably thousands in this sort of vaccine false information, probably cost thousands of lives in the adult population as well.
and I have a question actually about an adult vaccine. The FDA just recently approved Arexvy, one of the RSV mRNA vaccines, for 18 to 64, I think it was. I can't remember exactly, but who have high risk conditions. And as somebody married to someone with one of those conditions who said, "Hey, honey, you can get the RSV vaccine now," can he actually get the RSV vaccine since it hasn't gone to ACIP, but it's been approved by the FDA?
So that is another question that was an outstanding thing that ACIP, the adult RSV work group, was looking at carefully, was the underlying medical conditions and sort of the risk factors in the sort of younger age group. So these vaccines have now been approved by FDA for 18 people who are 18 and up, basically, who have high risk conditions. But ACIP was looking very carefully. The ACIP work group was evaluating very carefully about whether or not the risk conditions for younger adults with high risk conditions should be narrower than older adults. And that was one of the areas of active conversations. So ACIP actually, they haven't weighed in on this. And so it's kind of a weird situation. Usually we don't like to have a vaccine approved for a certain age group by the FDA, but then the recommendations for that group being unclear. And so this is, again, why we need to have a functioning ACIP. But I will say that I mean, there are like legit scientific questions, but the RSV vaccines in adults are really complicated. And you want people that are thoughtful and really understand the science to be looking at it, which is what we had prior to June, basically. And so I think that it can be prescribed because it is FDA approved, but it probably won't be covered by insurance because it's not recommended by ACIP in that age group yet. And that was something that they were planning on voting for. I don't know if that sounds right to everybody.
Which conditions qualify you as being at risk? So if you're someone who thinks you're at risk, I guess it's just a conversation with your doctor and you decide if you want to pay out.
Well, I will say IDSA has put out guidelines specifically for immunocompromised people, and they define the groups that should receive RSV vaccines among all age groups. So I would say you can look among adults. So if you are a clinician and you're looking for like guidance on terms of like immunocompromised and which conditions qualify, what they are recommending. But again, it's not an ACIP recommendation. It's not a CDC recommendation yet because we don't have one in that age group. Does that sound right to everybody? Like, I don't know if others want to weigh in.
Yeah, but given that it is approved, if it's available, it can be prescribed.
It just may not be.
I haven't right, and I haven't seen the package insert to see how the FDA define those high risk groups, whether that's actually mentioned in the label or not.
And just to make sure, this kind of goes along with the question about the other changes that were made by ACIP this year that have all been stayed now. That also includes the non-recommendation, I guess, for MMRV. They had said, so in other words, can the new group of people change the MMRV information to the VFC program? Can that now be canceled, and can VFC memo now allow for MMRV? Instead of just MMR. For those who don't know what I'm referring to, that's the measles, mumps, rubella, varicella, chickenpox vaccine. And this group had originally said that VFC should not be giving that quadrivalent vaccine, that they should give the MMR and the varicella vaccine separately. But presumably now they can give it.
I don't want to speak out of turn, but I believe they changed the recommendation without changing VFC. Is that correct, Paul and Fiona? I could be completely wrong.
Well, I think the recommendation they made was that they didn't recommend the MMRV vaccine for the 12 to 15-month-old, but you could give it to the 4 to 6-year-old.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So still in VFC, Tara. Yeah.
Okay.
But
And
that
that
is a question about the other vaccines that they sort of took away was the thimerosal containing flu vaccine. So these are all questions that I think we're going to have to be sorted out. Like those were previously available as an option. What they weren't used very much, but I think both. Yeah, I think the VOC resolution when they voted to change it to no longer recommend MMRV in the younger age group, I think at the same time they voted they had a separate vote as they always do for VFC that did change it. And I see Melinda Wharton, who was the
Melinda Wharton.
ACIP. She's the ACIP. She was the ACIP executive secretary before she was removed from that position in June. So she's saying that in there, like,
Word of
so
God.
yeah. So I think I guess it's a question now about whether or not that's going to be an option. That was a vaccine that had been approved for a long time that was taken away as an option by this newly formed committee, and now that they've been sort of, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what happens with that now that the votes that they undertook have been sort of canceled in a way.
Okay, cool. We don't have any other questions in, so I'm just gonna give each person, does anyone have any final thoughts they want to convey? Again, keeping in mind our audience here, it's quite a heterogeneous audience of journalists, public health experts, advocates, general public, interested people, clinicians. Any last words you want to offer out there? Anyone? No?
Just to thank Richard Hughes and his team for fighting the good fight.
Yeah.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us. A reminder that this webinar will be posted publicly. We really appreciate everybody tuning in to find all this out, and we really appreciate all of our speakers trying to clarify a very, very confusing time in vaccines right now. And hopefully this nightmare will be over soon. So thank you very much, everybody. Take care, and everyone have a good week.